The world calls it a geopolitical conflict. It calls it a struggle for regional hegemony, a proxy war, nuclear tension in the Oriente Medio. Experts build models, diplomats propose deals, think tanks publish reports hundreds of pages long trying to decipher what happens between Israel and Iran. But there is one detail that none of these documents mention. This conflict was described with pinpoint accuracy 4,000 years ago, and the name of the man who started it is not Netanyahu. It is not Khamenei. It is Abrao. Put it into the right perspective. Abrao, originally called Abrao, was not a mythological character without a historical address. He was a real man with a real wife, a real tent, and a specific human problem. He had a promise that his descendants would form a nation as numerous as the stars, and he had no son. He had been born in the city of Ur dos Chaldeos, in the south of what is today Iraq, in a period that historians and archaeologists place between 2001 and 1900 BC. He migrated to Canaan with his wife Sarai and reached the territory that today comprises Israel, Palestine, and Jordania, carrying a promise that would take decades to begin to be fulfilled. That delay was the trigger. The book of Genesis, written over 3,300 years ago and preserved as one of the most studied historical documents of human civilization, is specific about the breaking point. Deus had said to Abrao, as recorded in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, "I will make of thee a great nation." But the years passed, 10 years since Abrao arrived in Canaan, then 11, then 12. Sarai was 85 years old. Abrao was over 80. The promise was still just a promise. This is where the error begins. It was not an error of malice. It was not a decision made by someone with the intent to destroy the future. It was a decision made by two human beings who were tired of waiting. And that is exactly the most disturbing detail of this entire story. The greatest civilizational fractures in human history do not begin with great evils. They begin with small, understandable decisions made by people who believed they were doing the right thing within the circumstances surrounding them. Sarai had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. In the ancient Near East, the practice of an infertile wife offering her servant to her husband to father an heir was recognized and legally documented in the codes of Hammurabi, which circulated in that same region and at that same time. Sarai was not proposing something monstrous within the cultural framework in which she lived. She was proposing a rational way out of a problem that had lasted more than a decade. The words are recorded in Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. Now Sarai, Abrao's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abrao, "The Señor has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abrao accepted. Hagar conceived, and here begins the second layer of the error, because when Hagar realized she was pregnant, something changed in the dynamic between her and Sarai. The text records that Hagar began to despise her mistress. It is not difficult to understand the psychology of that moment. Hagar was an Egyptian servant who suddenly carried what Sarai could not. The balance of power had shifted in a way that neither of them had fully anticipated. Sarai reacted harshly. Hagar fled into the desert. It was in the desert that the moment happened which geopolitical analysts will never put in their models. An angel found Hagar by a spring of water on the way to Sur and spoke to her words recorded in Genesis chapter 16, verses 11 and 12. "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ismael, for the Señor has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." The text is specific. It is not a metaphor. It is not a literary ornament without an address. It is a declaration about the historical nature of an entire lineage yet to be born, written before any modern border existed, before any map was drawn, before any army was formed. Hagar returned. Ismael was born. Abraham was 86 years old. For 13 years, Ismael was the only son of Abraham. For 13 years, he was the heir to everything: the promise, the possessions, the expectation of a nation that did not yet have a name. Abraham raised this son as if he were the fulfillment of what had been promised. And then, when Ismael was 13, Deus appeared again to Abraham, now renamed Abraham, and revealed that the promise would be fulfilled through another son, a son that Sarah would bear, Sarah at 90 years old. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. 2 sons, 2 brothers, from the same father, distinct futures promised before any border existed. Ismael received the promise of becoming a great nation, and the text records that he would become the father of 12 princes, whose descendants spread throughout what today comprises Arabia Saudita, Egitto, the Golfo Persico, and adjacent regions. Isaac received the specific covenant, the original pact, the continuity of the promise that would cross generations until the people who would become Israel. 2 historical arcs, destined from the beginning for the same territory. The final rupture happened on a specific day recorded in Genesis chapter 21. Sarah saw Ismael mocking Isaac during a celebration. The gesture was enough. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Verse 10. The text records that this deeply distressed Abraham. It was a father being asked to expel his firstborn, but the text says that Deus confirmed Sarah's request and promised that Ismael would also become a nation because he was Abraham's offspring. The next morning, Abraham got up early. He took some food and a skin of water. He set them on Hagar's shoulders, and he sent them away. One morning, one decision, 4,000 years of consequence. Hagar wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water was gone, she put Ismael under a bush and went to sit about 50 yards away, was because, as the text records with devastating emotional precision, she said, "I cannot watch the boy die." And she lifted up her voice and wept. The boy also wept. The text says that Deus heard the boy crying, not the mother, the boy. Hagar was instructed to lift Ismael up, because from him would come a great nation. And so it happened. Ismael grew. He became an archer in the desert of Paran. His mother chose an Egyptian wife for him. And the 12 sons of Ismael formed the peoples who inhabited the ark, stretching from Arabia to North Africa, from the Golfo Persico to the shores of the Mediterranean. Isaac remained in Canaan. His son Jacob was renamed Israel, and the 12 tribes that would descend from Jacob would form, millennia later, the state that has existed since 1948 in the same territory that the ancient texts promised from the beginning. The 2 lines followed parallel paths for generations, sometimes in direct conflict, sometimes in tense coexistence, always in the same territory, always with the same underlying tension: 2 peoples, 1 land, 1 promise that each side interprets in a different way. How did 2 brothers who wept in different deserts come to be the protagonists of the most dangerous conflict on the planet? The answer involves Persia. And this is where most modern readings stop anchoring the problem in history and start treating it as if it began in 1979. It did not. The Iraq of today is the Persia of yesterday. Not in a metaphorical sense, in the exact historical, geographical, and cultural sense. The Persian people have inhabited that territory for over 2,500 years of documented history, and Persia appears in the biblical records in more than 200 distinct contexts, not as a background figure, but as a protagonist in events that shaped the fate of the people of Israel. Cairo, the great king of Persia, is the only foreign leader called anointed in the Hebrew texts. It was Kiro who, around 538 BC, signed the decree that allowed the Jews to return from the Babylonico exile and rebuild the Templo in Jerusalem. The historical relationship between Persia and Israel has more than 2,500 years of verifiable documentation. And there is a specific text that changes the dimension of everything that happened in the 21st century. It is in the book of Ezekiel. Chapter 38, written approximately 2,600 years ago. The text describes a coalition of nations that would move against Israel, and among the nations named with geographical specificity is one called Paras. Paras is the ancient Hebrew name for Persia, for the territory that is now Iraq. Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 5. Paras, Cux, and Put with them. A coalition of nations with Persia explicitly named turned against Israel. 2,600 years before any ballistic missile, before any uranium enrichment, before any Islamic revolution. The text was not wrong. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 was not just a regime change. It was a complete ideological refounding of a state that, until that moment, maintained commercial and intelligence relations with Israel. The Ira of Tsar Reza Pahlavi cooperated with Israel. There was oil trade, intelligence exchange, and diplomatic representation on both sides. In less than 12 months, all of that was demolished. Ayatollah Khomeini built the new Iranian national identity on pillars that included anti-Zionism as a religious obligation and state policy. Israel became, in the official vocabulary of the new regime in Tehran, an illegitimate project that needed to be eliminated. Not negotiated, not contained, eliminated. 45 years later, that position has never changed. The Iranian nuclear program formally began in the 80s, during the Iran-Iraq War, when the country realized the depth of its strategic vulnerability against an enemy that used chemical weapons against soldiers and civilians for 8 years of conflict. The logic was that of any state that survived an existential war, never again be without maximum deterrence capability. In the 2000s, the program began to be described by regime officials as part of a larger historical mission, the construction of a capacity that would make Iran untouchable in the regional power equation. In 2023, Iranian authorities confirmed that the country had enriched uranium to 60%. A nuclear weapon requires 90%. The distance between 60 and 90 is technical. The time to bridge it, according to specialists from the International Atomic Energy Agency, is only a few weeks. Consider the weight of this. Israel has a nuclear arsenal estimated between 80 and 190 warheads, developed over more than 50 years of a clandestine program that has never been formally admitted. Iran is weeks away from nuclear capability, and both states have publicly declared in official and documented language that the existence of the other is unacceptable. And what happens when two states with public declarations of existential incompatibility reach the same level of mutual destruction capability? This is the question that deterrence models were built to never have to answer. Because classic deterrence, the kind that worked between the United States and the Soviet Union during 40 years of the Cold War, presupposes that both sides want to survive above all else. But Iran has, within its power structure, a theological current that does not treat collapse as something to be avoided, that treats apocalyptic confrontation as part of a historical destiny to be fulfilled. This is not campaign rhetoric. It is documented in decades of official statements, in the speeches of religious leaders with real authority over military decisions, and in doctrinal structures that coexist with the tactical calculations of the Corpo dos Guardiões da Revolução Islâmica. And then came the 7th of October, 2023. Hamas invaded southern Israel in the early hours of a Saturday. 1,201 people were murdered within hours. 253 were dragged as hostages into Gaza through tunnels that Iran had helped fund over the years. It was the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And the funding, training, and logistical coordination of that operation came in a determining proportion from Tehran. The pattern was not new. The scale was: Iran funds Hamas in Gaza. It funds Hezbollah in Lebanon, which maintains an arsenal estimated at 150,000 rockets pointed at northern Israel, more rockets than most national armies on the planet possess. It funds Shiite militias in Iraq. It funds the Houthis in Yemen, who attacked maritime routes in the Mar Vermelho and launched drones against Israeli territory from distances exceeding 2,000 kilometers. This is what regional security strategists call the axis of resistance, a network of non-state armed forces, funded and armed by Tehran, built specifically to create constant pressure on Israel from multiple borders at once, making any Israeli response a logistical problem with no clean solution. It is not improvisation. It is a 40-year strategy. And then came the night of April 14th, 2024. For the first time in history, Iran attacked Israel directly from its own territory. 331 projectiles were launched in a single operational window, 170 Shahed drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 126 ballistic missiles. The operation was named by the Iranian regime True Promise. The projectiles traveled more than 1,500 kilometers. Israel, with direct support from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Jordania, intercepted 99% of them before they hit the territory. 99%. The world celebrated the defense as a technological marvel, and it was. But there is a dimension that news bulletins did not articulate with proper clarity. The day after that attack, the world woke up with a new fact permanently installed in the strategic reality of the Oriente Medio. Direct state-to-state attack had happened, the threshold had been crossed, and no diplomatic agreement erases that collective memory. Not the memory of military planners, nor the memory of intelligence systems, nor the memory of leaders who must calculate what comes next. Put the human cost into this equation, because what began with the era of Abram is not abstract. It has faces, it has weight. It has the sound of someone crying in a desert and someone searching for someone in the rubble. It has the face of Hagar, walking through the desert of Beersheba with an empty skin and a son she placed under a bush because she could not bear to look at him and see death arriving. It has the face of Sarah looking at the two brothers at a party and making a decision she believed to be just, because within the logic of the covenant she had received and the promise she had waited 90 years to see fulfilled, it probably was. It has the face of Abraham rising before dawn on a specific morning to hand bread and water to a son he himself had fathered, and whom he was sending into the desert because something greater than him said it was necessary. He did not want to. The text is explicit about this, but he went. 4,000 years later, the cost has other faces. It has the face of a family in the kibbutz near Oz, waking up at 6:29 in the morning on October 7th, 2023, to the sound of sirens and then the sound of gunmen inside their home. It has the face of a mother in Rafah, searching for her son in the rubble of a building that existed the morning before. It has the face of an Iranian soldier executing a mission he believes to be sacred, because he was taught since childhood that Zionism is the absolute enemy and that eliminating it is an obligation that transcends politics. It has the face of an Israeli recruit in an armored reserve, sleeping in uniform, waiting for an order that could start the largest conflict the Oriente Medio has seen since current borders were drawn. Each of these faces believes, with reason within their own context, that they are on the right side of history. And that is exactly the cruelest trap of the oldest conflict in the world. Every side has a coherent internal narrative. Every side has an understandable motive. Every side made decisions that made sense within the circumstances that previous generations built around them. The collective result of all these individually defensible reasons is a situation that has lasted 4,000 years and has no solution within the vocabulary of modern geopolitics. Because you cannot dissolve with diplomacy what was inscribed before any diplomat was born. The Acordos de Abraham, signed in 2020, normalized relations between Israel and 4 Arab countries, the Emiratos Árabes Unidos, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, altering the regional geometry in a way no analyst had predicted a decade earlier. Arabia Saudita was in an advanced process of negotiating normalization with Israel at the exact moment Hamas launched the attack of October 7, 2023. The attack interrupted that process, but it did not cancel it. Iran understood what was at stake. A Saudi normalization with Israel would have isolated Tehran as the only major regional actor maintaining an openly anti-Israel stance. October 7th was, among other things, a strategic response to that possibility, an attempt to rearrange the board before it reorganized permanently against the interests of the República Islámica. It worked for now. Normalization is suspended. The war in Gaza has consumed the regional narrative, and Iran remains at the center of everything, exactly where the texts from 2,600 years ago positioned it. In 2024, Iran had accumulated approximately 120 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, an amount sufficient, with additional enrichment to 90%, to build between 3 and 4 nuclear devices. The International Atomic Energy Agency documented that Iran has systematically hindered inspections at least at 4 previously undeclared nuclear facilities. The negotiations in Vienna are paralyzed, diplomatic channels are blocked, and 2 states with public declarations of existential incompatibility are technically weeks away from nuclear parity. The Book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, does not describe a diplomatic tie. It does not describe a negotiated resolution between representatives in suits shaking hands for the cameras. It describes a historical climax whose final point has not yet arrived. And the conflict between Israel and Iran is, with a precision that no contemporary intelligence model anticipated, within the arc that text described 2,600 years before the first Shahed drone took off from a base in Persia toward the Mediterranean. Abrah's mourning, Hagar's desert, Ismail's cry, and the world still thinks this has a solution in Vienna. The Iranian nuclear program remains active. The Vienna Agreement negotiations remain paralyzed. Israel maintains its doctrine of preemption. Hezbollah still controls southern Lebanon. The Faixa de Gaza still bleeds. The world still has not resolved anything. The book of Genesis, chapter 16, recorded that Ismael would be a wild man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in the presence of all his brothers. The text did not speak of an individual. It spoke of a lineage, of a historical arc that has not yet reached its final point. That arc is still open, and you are living inside of it.